Hey, everybody. I'm really excited to welcome my guest, Dr. Amber Kinser, and she's here
Hi.
to talk to us today about imposter syndrome. So
Right.
without further ado, good afternoon. How are you?
I am well, thank you. Thank you for letting me be on the podcast. I'm excited about it. I appreciate it.
Yeah, me too. So why don't you tell the audience a little about yourself and what you do and why you're passionate about imposter syndrome?
So I am a communication expert and a consultant and a certified coach. I have a PhD in communication, emphasizing interpersonal communication. In my consulting and coaching practice, I work primarily with leaders, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them are in academia. So they might be faculty or department chairs or deans or just purely administrators. And we focus on what I call soft skill savvy mostly. And that's things like executive presence, emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, time and energy management, imposter feelings, managing imposter feelings, and other soft skills. So today I want to talk about I'm going to talk about imposter syndrome. And you had asked why am I passionate about it? I have struggled with imposter syndrome for much of my adult life, and in the last several years have started pursuing research on it, reading everything I could find on it, and learning a great deal. Recently took a course with the Impostor Syndrome Institute, so I'm now what's called an imposter syndrome informed coach. So I learned, as the more I learned about it, the more I learned about how manageable it is, which I didn't know. I just thought it was just sort of a thing that you lived with, and that was about it. But I've learned a lot about it as a cluster of habits, essentially. So I wanted to share that with other people who are struggling with imposter syndrome.
I think
That's it.
that's great. For the people out there who have never heard of imposter syndrome or maybe think they've
Mhm.
heard of it but don't really understand it, can you just give us some background? What is it? Why do people struggle with it?
Sure. So imposter syndrome is, and I want to clarify that syndrome, by that, we don't mean any kind of medical diagnosis. It's like a cluster of habits. So it's also called imposter phenomenon in the research about it, and imposterism and imposter thinking and imposter feelings and any number of things. But regardless of how you talk about it, it is real, and it can have very negative consequences for individuals, but also organizations and businesses. And it's that organizations and businesses part that a lot of people don't know about. So I'm hoping to be able to be part of sort of informing the public about the cost of imposterism on businesses as well. So it is a belief that you are not as competent or capable or qualified as other people seem to think that you are. There are three parts according to the Imposter Syndrome Institute. That's one. The other one is that when you do recognize your successes or your accomplishments, you attribute those to external sources like luck or timing, or I had connections or something like that. And then the third one is this sort of ongoing fear that you're going to be found out and kind of pegged as a fraud and in positions you have no business being in. So that's imposter syndrome. Um, it's a little bit different from self-esteem. Self-esteem is an ongoing thing, carries across context, and imposter syndrome seems to be largely directed at areas of achievement. So if I'm just sort of engaging in everyday life activities, I don't necessarily feel like an imposter, though I may have low self-esteem in the midst of all of that. And it's also different from this sort of thing that we all feel sometimes about feeling a little bit out of your league or like you're out of your depth kind of thing, which pretty much everybody feels at some point in their life. So it's different from those things because it's got this attributing success to outside, fear of feeling like a fraud, and a recognition that other people recognize you as having achieved things, but that you don't think those are accurate indicators of your strengths.
Now, this is the first time I've heard imposter syndrome in the context of a business or organization. Can you
Mm.
expand on that a little bit?
People, a lot of our sense of achievement comes from work. And so people are struggling a lot of times at work with this feeling of being an imposter. And there are so many organizations and businesses that miss out on really great leaders, critical employees that they lose because of burnout, which I'll explain in a minute. And so and people will quit because of burnout, or you've heard the phrase silent quitting, right? That came sort of post-pandemic, that people are still working, they're still there, but they're not really there. They're not contributing. They're just sort of being present, sort of, and that's about it, and not doing much else. And so organizations lose out on what often are very capable employees, um, because the people don't feel like they deserve it. They also don't put themselves forward for leadership positions or for more advanced opportunities, because these are all strategies of avoidance, because they believe they don't deserve it, or they can't hack it, or that they'll be found out as a fraud. And so then their feelings of accomplishments and their career really can suffer. Another strategy of avoidance is when people are in executive positions and they avoid interacting, connecting with their peers, their fellow executives, because they sort of feel like those executives are the real executives, or the real fill in the blank, whatever the job title is. I'm just sort of in the position. I experienced that as a department head in academe, certainly early on in my tenure as a department chair. And I didn't really connect or go to lunch or hang out with my fellow department chairs, because I felt like they were real chairs. And I was just kind of in the chair position, but not really all that qualified for it. So then I miss out on opportunities for social support and just being able to draw from my peers and learn from my peers, learn some of the strategies of dealing with the complexities of the job. So yeah, so that's how it relates to work and to
Hmm.
organizations.
Yeah, yeah. That brings two questions to mind.
Okay.
The first one is, especially in this day and age where so much is online and it's so easy for people after the fact to go back and gather information, and especially if someone wants to bring you down, they can use so many methods to try to discredit you.
Okay.
So I guess my first question is, how do you know when you are qualified and you're in a position where you're experiencing imposter syndrome, but you really are qualified, versus you're in a position where you probably really shouldn't be in?
Well, I think one of the things you have to do is take a look at what are the qualifications that the position required, and whether or not you met those qualifications. And at some level, you have to trust the people who hired you for the position. I think if you're trying repeatedly, if you're feeling constantly out of your league and you're trying repeatedly to get information and knowledge that you need to be able to do the job well, and you can't seem to get on top of that, I think honestly, I feel like if you get a coach, and that coach can help you. And if after all of that you still can't get on top of the job, and you talk with your supervisor and that sort of thing, then I mean, certainly there are people who are in positions that they're not quite qualified for. But the thing too is that most positions are things that you can learn, right? So you get this position, you don't know how to do these things, and imposter goes, oh my gosh, I'm so far out of my league. But someone who doesn't struggle with imposter syndrome says, boy, I have a lot to learn. And they pursue it. A person who's struggling with imposterism is saying, I am not qualified, instead of, I need to do some work to be able to catch up on these tasks. So a lot of times those positions are something that someone could learn if they weren't feeling so inadequate to the task.
I really love that you made that distinction, because the world is changing so fast every day that even if you are fully qualified today, tomorrow you might be
Right,
quite underqualified no matter how much training you have,
right, right.
or your industry might go under.
Right.
You have to learn a completely new industry. And I think that's one of the important points is if you're not suffering from imposter syndrome, your inner dialogue, your inner thoughts, your mindset is, okay, here we are. This is what I need to learn. Where am I going to
Right.
find the resources to learn it? And I'm going to knock it out of the ballpark.
And this is one of the strategies that I use when I'm working with people who are struggling with imposterism, which is to sort of adopt a growth mindset. If you're interested in studying growth mindset, you can look at Carol Dweck's book called Mindset. But she talks about people who have a growth mindset versus people who have a fixed mindset. And people with a growth mindset will see challenges as opportunities to learn and grow. And people with fixed mindsets see challenges as sort of evidence that they're out of their league. And so, she studied sort of kids doing really complicated puzzles. And some of the kids were like, yeah, this is really challenging. Hooray, let's do it. And other kids are like, I'm not really that interested in it because it was hard. And people who are dealing with imposterism have a lot of times have a fixed mindset. They feel like if it's hard for me, then I must not be good at it. And that's proof that I'm an imposter. Instead of it's hard for me because it's challenging and I could learn it. So working with someone who can help you with developing a growth mindset is critical for managing imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting you gave that example about the kids doing the hard puzzles. I remember reading about some studies, and this goes back to mindset and how you look at a problem. Studies where they gave kids an escalating number of challenges to do, and they told one set, you're really brilliant. I know you're going to get this. And they told another set, you work really, really hard, so I'm confident that you can get this. And the ones that were told they were really smart, as the things became harder and harder, some sort of internal thing clicked and they would stop doing it because they subconsciously believed that if they couldn't do it, that would mean that they are no longer smart. Whereas the kids that were told, you got this, you work hard at it, they continue to do it. And
Right.
that's almost like a subliminal mindset that they have to recognize and then overcome.
And that's a matter of understanding competence as something that is just innate. Either you have it or you don't. Instead of it's an ongoing practice of learning and growing. This idea of learning and growing, using challenges as opportunity, I'm embarrassed to say is fairly new to me. I probably was introduced to it some time ago, but it never really clicked until the last several years when I really started pursuing imposter syndrome in earnest and learning to think about setbacks or mistakes as opportunity to learn something new or to get better. For someone dealing with imposter syndrome, that's very difficult because if they have mistakes or setbacks, they see it as proof that they don't know what they're doing, or they're out of their league, or they're not competent or not capable.
That is so true.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of the book The Obstacle is Away by Ryan Holiday?
I don't know that book.
It's a great one. It's basically says everything you just said, that it's all about the mindset. When you see an obstacle, look at it as an opportunity instead of an obstacle. And one of the podcasts I did was with Nick Klingensmith, and he talks about his struggles, and now he sees every obstacle as an opportunity. And he's converted his mindset into overcoming Spartan races.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
So I
amazing.
love all this talk about, the obstacle is not an obstacle, but an opportunity. And I need to hear it for myself. I love saying that out loud because because I don't know about you, but I've noticed in my life, the more I progress, the more obstacles come up and the harder it gets. So you have to keep honing that skill to want to overcome those obstacles because they just keep getting bigger and tougher.
Right. And then seeing these things, these setbacks or mistakes or whatever, it's just, wow, that was really hard for me. Instead of, this is hard for me. What does it mean about me as a person? That's something that people with struggling with imposterism will do, is they internalize sort of these moments as a comment about who they are as a person. So I must not be smart enough. I must not be competent, instead of, I am just really always going to struggle with spreadsheets. I think this is me. I think I'm going to, Excel is just not my pal. Always need give me a good Microsoft Word document any day. But Excel is a little tricky for me. And I had just felt inadequate for years I still have to learn how to use it better, but it's an opportunity to get better at something new.
Now, where would you say imposter syndrome comes from? Why do we have it? Where does it come from?
Okay, well, it comes from a variety of places. One of the places it may come from early childhood experiences. Maybe you grew up in a family where mistakes were not tolerated. My father was not good about children making mistakes. He's Marine, and it's all was pretty rigid. So maybe you grew up where sort of perfection is the only thing that's tolerated, or you did well, but people sort of didn't really care. You didn't put a lot of stock in succeeding. So you didn't really have a good measure for what can I feel good about. So some of it comes from childhood socialization. Some of it is coming from cultural messages like race and class and gender stereotypes, where people from marginalized groups sort of get messages all the time that they're not good enough, not as good as the dominant group, or feeling like they have to try 10 times harder to get sort of equal treatment and that sort of thing. So it makes sense that it's not surprising that people walk away with a sense of a feeling, feeling like an imposter. And, as is so often the case, we look at social media and you can see examples everywhere of seeming perfection and excellence and amazingness. And it's difficult for probably most of us to feel like, we're as on top of it as we could be when we've got multiple examples of what seems to be effortless kind of brilliance around us. So those are some of the places that it emerges from.
Yeah, and I would imagine as we get older, it becomes stronger, because at a certain point we have to go out into the workforce and either get a job or start a business. And of course, when you're working at a job, your employer doesn't want you to make mistakes because it affects
Right.
the bottom line, and they need to make a profit to stay in business, or they have to close shop. They have to be able to pay their employees, pay the rent, pay the insurance, and all the endless number of hidden fees that is involved with taking a business,
Right.
with having a business. And then, of course, if you work at a job, especially if you work at a high level job as maybe a doctor, a firefighter, a lawyer, I mean, mistakes can have long ranging
Right.
consequences. So it's almost like two sides of a coin. I mean, you have to be comfortable with being able to make mistakes because that's how you learn, but you also have to try hard to not make certain mistakes because there's long-reaching consequences. So that's kind of an interesting duality there. And I'm wondering if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
I mean, certainly there are, as you're pointing out, certainly there are positions where the mistakes have serious consequences. We would like our bridge engineers to not make any of those when they're designing the bridge, and the builders to not make any mistakes when they're building the bridge and that sort of thing. So certainly there are places where you can't just say, well, the bridge collapsed, but I learned something. But I do think it's a complicated thing to be able to navigate. People with imposter syndrome are feeling like they've disappointed so many people, even if they're not in a position where, they're designing and building bridges, still feel like it's got significant impact and that everyone is gonna, sort of know. So, I mean, I don't have an answer for how you can distinguish those. I mean, I guess people know whether the sort of the cost of their mistakes. And I suspect that in training, when people are learning, creating a learning environment, I'm talking about people who are being trained to be a doctor or trained to be an engineer, creating a learning environment where challenges and mistakes are seen as learning opportunities. I say that because otherwise I think people might be inclined to hide their mistakes and try and gloss over them because they feel like it's so shameful to make a mistake. So some of that is really grounded in what the learning environment for those positions, so that when it's in the early stages and you're still learning and mistakes are something you can work around and improve upon, that those are embraced as part of a necessary part of the process.
And that's a really good point, because I know in a lot of professional schools, people are afraid of making a mistake just because they don't want to appear stupid. But that's where you
Yes,
make the mistakes, is in the training, so that you learn
right.
from it, so that by the time you get to the point where you're actually building the bridge, you've already made and learned from the mistakes
Yes,
and learned the proper way to build it.
right. But that requires a learning environment that is receptive to mistakes.
Right.
And all learning environments aren't like that. In fact, I think one of the most significant changes that organizations need to make is an appreciation of mistakes and building an environment of continuous learning, so that people feel like they always could improve. And that improving doesn't mean wanting to improve something, doesn't mean you're inadequate. It just means that that there's always room for growth. I always felt like, if my boss sent me something back, I would just sort of flog myself about it because I should have gotten it right the first time. And that's a mind trick that imposterism plays, that if you were smart, you'd get it right the first time. And of course, few people get anything right the first time. And finding a way to sort of work through that and learn it is really the sticking point.
Right. And I would imagine the key to success is overcoming the fixed mindset, getting into a growth mindset so you don't have the imposter syndrome. Because even starting your own business, I mean, there's competition out there, and a lot of competition is nasty and negative, and they're going to directly try to hit you at the
Right.
point, especially if they know you have a imposter syndrome. That's going
Right.
to be extra fuel for them, those areas, to get you to crumble and close your business or fail. What's the solution? Say you're out there, you know you have imposter syndrome. What are the steps you need to take to get that inner strength, that growth mindset that you need to not be affected by these external factors or the biggest internal factor, which is yourself?
Well, the Imposter Syndrome Institute says that Valerie Young, who's the sort of the thought leader on imposter syndrome, who co-founded the Imposter Syndrome Institute, says that the only way to stop feeling like an imposter is to stop thinking like an imposter. And then learning what are the ways that people with imposterism think, and how can I change those thought habits or those thought distortions, and then create new thoughts. She also says that you have to change. This is really the key. This is what was really important for me, I think. Changing your relationship to competence and to mistakes and setbacks. You have to have a different kind of relationship with competence. And that means you have to understand things like competence does not mean perfection. Competence does not mean getting it right the first time. Competence does not mean you know all the things. It doesn't mean that you have to be all the things to all the people in order to be competent. So these are some of the thought distortions that people who are struggling with imposter syndrome use, and it keeps them stuck. So rethinking what gets to count as competence is important. Thinking about how connections, like I had some connections, and that's how they got in. Like I felt like I got into my doctoral program because my advisor knew someone over there, instead of realizing that an entire team of faculty is deciding who gets in the program. It wasn't just about your advisor and his buddy. This was like more complicated than that. So realizing that connections are a part of many successes. This does not discount the success. That luck is a part of many successes. You happen to be in the right place at the right time is a part of many successes. One of the strategies that people struggling with imposterism will use is to discount what they're doing and assign it to external factors like luck and timing and connections, or my personality. They just liked me. It's not really about my competence or my accomplishments. I just, whatever. I'm funny and I made them like me. That's why they did it. So to think about being liked, having connections, having a little luck, being in the right place at the right time, these are part of many successes. And if they are a part of your successes, it doesn't discount the success. So thinking about competence as including those things, and that doesn't negate what you've accomplished. Also, if you had help, people struggling with imposterism feel like they have to do it all by themselves in order for it to count as an accomplishment. Competence means knowing where to go to get the kind of help that you need. It includes that. So that's what I mean by changing relationship with competence. And then as I talked about, really shifting how you think about mistakes and setbacks and allowing those to happen and not using them as proof that you don't know what you're doing and that you don't belong in the position that you're in. What they are proof of is that you're striving. And they're proof that you're human. And they're proof that you have some areas where you could grow and you have some great learning opportunities right there before you. Those are the things that it's proof of, not that you're incompetent. So the first thing is changing that relationship to competence and to mistakes and setbacks.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned, and I really like this, that you have to go from a person who thinks like an imposter to a person who is not an imposter. Do you want to give a few examples of some really strong thoughts that you would have if you don't exhibit imposter syndrome? Like what are the actual thoughts in your head?
If you don't feel like an imposter?
Exactly.
Well, it's the stuff that I've talked about in that it's somebody who doesn't feel like an imposter says, I made a mistake. Let me see how I can fix it. Like, gosh, I thought I would have done a lot better on that, but I guess based on my boss's reaction, I did not do better on that. So maybe I should meet with her and see how I can do this better. Someone who is not an imposter, when they get a performance review and there are areas of critique, isn't devastated by it because they know that it's not a sign of who they are, but maybe some things that they're doing. You can change some of the things that you're doing. It's a lot harder to change the core of who you are. If you feel like an imposter, negative performance review is a wipeout because it feels like it's a personal kind of attack or criticism instead of it's a comment on some of the things that you're doing that your supervisor would like you to do differently. And if you don't know how to do those, or you thought you were doing those already, then you have some room for growth. So seeing the opportunity in sort of critiques or setbacks and not automatically seeing them as a comment about who you are. So that's one of the things. And then seeing those learning opportunities, allowing yourself to make a mistake. And I mean, I keep saying this, but it's so critical, and not being devastated by that. If you get something back from your supervisor, it just means you need to try and do something differently. And if you don't know how to do it differently, then you ask the supervisor, I really don't know how to do this differently. Can you help me? Or can I get a coach? Or is there someone here at work that I could, for example, I might have said, who are some of the department chairs that are doing this really well? So I can go talk to them. But for a person with imposter syndrome to go talk to someone and say you don't know how to do something is terrifying, because it feels like proof that you're an imposter instead of proof that you're trying to learn something. People who do not feel like imposters are not so daunted by mistakes and are not worried that criticisms are something about who they are as a person. Another thing too is to sort of reinterpret some of your responses to things. So let's say you just gave a presentation, or you're getting ready to give a presentation and you're nervous about it. It doesn't mean that you are unqualified to give the presentation. It means you're nervous, but people get nervous. People with imposter syndrome feel like these things are exclusive to them. And they don't realize that this being nervous before you present something is just sort of part of the process. So some other thoughts that people who don't feel like imposters have is they don't feel like they have to be everything to everybody. They don't feel like they have to overwork in order to prove that they know what they're doing. They don't tend to avoid opportunities that are going to be really challenging because they tend to have more of a growth mindset. So those are some of the ways that people who are not imposters think. And really, imposter thinking is Valerie Young argues that it's maybe 82% of the population, so it's not a particularly rare thing. Some people struggle with it more, and other people handle it better. But it's something that both women and men feel. Early research suggested that it was mostly women responding to that, but women and men and all kinds of people, all kinds of folks can be affected by it.
As you were talking, a couple of examples that I know of came to mind. There was, I forget exactly who it is, but I remember listening to this salesperson talk about when they were early on in sales, they started this job. They were the bottom of the heap. The first evaluation came through and they were the worst. And they were told, listen, you got 2 weeks to turn this around. And I would imagine if he had been an imposter, he would have been devastated.
Oh my gosh.
However, he was
I'm
not.
like having a physical reaction to this story.
He was not. So he's like, actually, I think the story when he was going to be fired, but he talked to his boss and he's like, look, I think I got it in me. Give me 2 weeks. Give me 2 weeks. I want you to teach me everything you know, and then let's reevaluate. And so he talked his boss into keeping him, and he became the top salesperson.
Wow, what a great story.
And it brings me to mind another person that I knew actually did a podcast with me earlier. He was born with cerebral palsy, told he would never walk. When they went to do the high school interview, he was told, this guy is not going to amount to anything. He's not college material. And he wasn't an imposter. So he decided, you know what? Not only am I going to go to college, but I love baseball. And he ended up going on his high school varsity baseball team. He ended up going to college and getting a job in sales and was the top salesperson.
Wow.
Until he left sales.
Right.
So it was just amazing.
As I look around, I can see that people struggling with imposterism are holding back, and that they and the organizations really miss out from that. Some other habits that people who struggle with imposterism use is, I talked about overworking and avoiding, but this a chronic procrastination is another strategy to avoid getting started or avoiding finishing out of fear that what you produce is going to come up lacking. And if you never started it and you never turn it in, then you save yourself from anyone critiquing, produce nothing. You're not going to be able to keep your job that way, just sort of putting it off. So, and then sometimes just sort of good old self-sabotage, showing up late, acting out, all of these things that can get a person fired so they don't have to deal with the possibility of coming up, lacking. So these are some of the strategies that people struggling with imposterism will use, and they kind of work in the short term. I mean, they work in that they save you from being criticized or having your work reviewed, but they don't have long-lasting positive impact. And you don't grow. That's right. The most troubling thing is that people who are really ensconced in an imposterism sort of mindset are missing so many opportunities to grow and lead and expand their thinking and their horizons, because they have a very restricted view of what gets to count as competence. And they have a very fearful view of mistakes and setbacks. But those things can be managed. That's the thing. You don't have to be stuck with imposterism. Those things can be managed.
Yeah, do you have an example in your own life where you went in and you had the growth mindset and you overcame an obstacle that someone with imposter syndrome would have failed?
Mhm.
Or-
Um, well, I spent a lot of time in my career as a teacher and a mentor. And so when I went to coaching school, I had to learn a completely different way of responding to other people's concerns. So I was so used to saying, well, here's a suggestion. Why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? Or if I was teaching, here's how you do it.
Mhm.
And coaching is not that, like, at all. You don't tell people what to do. And this really, I felt like I am never going to get this. Am I ever going to get this? And then I thought, and we were, in a room full of people, and I thought there are lots of people who have done mentoring and teaching and organizational leadership and that sort of thing. And I bet there are others who struggle with it. And I'm just going to learn this. These people are not miles ahead of me, I don't think. I'm just going to learn it. And I kept thinking, I can learn this. It's not a permanent state. What I don't know right now isn't a permanent state that I just have to learn to live with. So I just sort of kept at it and did get finish the school and did get the certification, and then I had to do the exam, and that was complicated, but I had to do it twice. In fact, it was a performance exam where you're doing an actual coaching session. And I didn't pass the first time. And I thought, people don't necessarily pass the first time. This is not as, so I had to keep saying those things, even though sometimes I didn't really feel it. Like, it's okay. You don't have to do it the first time. Really, I wanted to do it the first time. I did at some level feel like if I was ever going to get this, I'd be able to get it the first time around. But that's just not what happened for me. I had to take that performance exam twice. And anyway, so I did pass it, and I did sort of recite to myself these growth mindset principles of, this is an opportunity. I can figure this out. This is not, my not knowing is not a permanent state. And I just had to keep saying that until it became real to me.
That's
And,
beautiful.
and then just kept working at it. So I don't know if that's the kind of example you were looking for, but yeah, that's an example of not letting the imposter voice win. It was still there. It was still had plenty to say back here in the background, trying to bring me down. But I had learned these other tools, by which I mean different ways of thinking, that allowed me to navigate what was looking pretty dismal at some moments.
And I
Coaching
think that
is
was another,
hard. This is one of the things I learned. It is hard.
and I
It's
think that's another one of the keys, which goes back to the growth mindset, is to not see something as a permanent situation, that
right.
it's going to be a temporary situation. What are the steps you're going to take to get out of it?
Right. And having the confidence is a practice. It's not either you have it or you don't. You have to keep practicing it. And
Right.
sometimes you have to go forth as if you're not scared. Right. So you engage in the physical activity of someone who is not scared. I have been teaching public speaking for my career, and I still get exceptionally nervous before I speak. But I finally learned that if I can just get going, then sort of my body will remember that I know how to do this. But very early on, I'm just super anxious. And I don't know that I'm ever going to get rid of that. So what I learned was how to venture forth despite the nervousness. The nervousness doesn't mean that I'm not good at it.
Right. Right.
The nervousness means that I'm nervous, or that I'm anxious, or as Valerie Young says, that I'm excited. I'm excited and I want to do well. That's the other thing, is that people who are struggling with imposter syndrome misinterpret cues. So I'm really anxious means I don't belong here, instead of you're excited. She suggests
Now,
reinterpreting that.
we talked about a lot today. If you could sum up the most important points about imposter syndrome into a few words or a few sentences, how would you do it?
I would say imposterism or imposter syndrome is thought distortion that can be reconstructed. And those thought distortions are largely about competence and mistakes. And that adopting a growth mindset can help you manage imposter syndrome, rethinking what gets to count as competence, seeing mistakes and setbacks as growth opportunities and opportunities to learn. Those are some strategies that can help you with imposter syndrome.
Well said. I love to end each episode with a call to action for people, something that they can do. Maybe they're suffering, maybe in this case they have imposter syndrome and they want to get out of it. What's a simple step they can take without having to invest a lot of time or money to break free of that chain today?
Okay, so one of the things they could do is I have written imposter fighting mantras, sort of a daily kind of thing that you're going to recite to yourself that can help you rethink it. And it's about mistakes and setbacks and growth opportunities and competence and all those things that I've been talking about. So they could email me and I'll send those. My web address is amberkinser.com. So they could contact me through the website, or they can email me directly at amberkinser.com. And I just send those right over.
That sounds great.
And then using those as a way to guide how you're thinking during the day and help you.
All right. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed having you on this show and
Yeah, it was
having this
great. I love
conversation.
the conversation. Yeah, it was a good one. Thank you.